Hi, I'm Natalie. 3 hours into my wedding reception, I watched my sister Victoria slice my cake with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She handed me the first piece personally, insisting it was tradition for the bride to taste it before anyone else. 20 minutes later, I was on the floor of the Cascade Valley Country Club, convulsing as my new husband David screamed for help. The last thing I remember before the ambulance arrived was Victoria whispering to her husband Marcus, "Well, that's one problem solved." What she didn't know was that my brother-in-law General Thomas Rodriguez was already on his way from Fort Stevens, and he had resources she couldn't even imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my wedding dawned crisp and golden over Riverside, Oregon. October had painted the maple trees around our family estate in brilliant reds and oranges, and for the first time in months I felt like everything might actually work out. I stood at my bedroom window, still in my pajamas, watching the catering trucks roll up the gravel drive toward the Cascade Valley Country Club just beyond our property line. David had insisted we hold the reception there instead of in our backyard, saying his military family deserved something more formal. I didn't mind. After 26 years of living in Victoria's shadow, I was just grateful to have one day that was supposed to be mine. Victoria appeared in my doorway without knocking, already dressed in her burgundy maid of honor dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in soft waves that cascaded over one shoulder, and her makeup looked like it had been applied by a professional, which it probably had been. Marcus never let her leave the house looking anything less than magazine perfect. "Good morning, bride," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd perfected over the years. Sweet on the surface, with just enough edge underneath to let you know she was in control. "I brought you coffee. We need to talk." She set a steaming mug on my dresser, the kind of expensive Ethiopian blend she'd discovered during her brief phase of trying to become a coffee connoisseur. Everything Victoria did was a phase. Art collecting, wine tasting, interior design, charity work. She'd throw herself into something completely for 6 months, become moderately successful at it, then move on to the next thing that caught her attention. The only constant in her life was her need to be the center of attention and her marriage to Marcus, a real estate developer who treated her like an accessory he'd purchased to complete his image. "What's wrong?" I asked, pulling a robe over my shoulder. Victoria never brought me coffee unless she wanted something. "Nothing's wrong. I just thought we should discuss the reception timeline." She perched on the edge of my bed, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "I've been thinking about the cake cutting ceremony. We'd gone over the timeline 3 times with the wedding planner. Everything was already set in stone, from the cocktail hour to the last dance. What about it? Well, traditionally the maid of honor helps serve the cake to the guest. I thought it would be nice if I could cut the first slice for you. You know, as a gesture of sisterly love." Victoria's smile was radiant, the kind that had charmed teachers, boyfriends, and our parents for as long as I could remember. "Besides, you'll be so overwhelmed with congratulations and photos. Let me handle the details." Something cold settled in my stomach, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Victoria had been nothing but helpful throughout the wedding planning process. She'd organized my bridal shower, coordinated with the florist when I was too busy with work, and even drove 3 hours to Portland to pick up my dress when the alterations were finished early. She'd been the perfect maid of honor, which should have made me happy. Instead, it made me nervous. "I appreciate the offer, but David and I practiced the cake cutting yesterday. We've got it down to a choreographed dance." I tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "Besides, isn't it bad luck for anyone but the bride and groom to cut the wedding cake?" Victoria's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh, come on, Nat. You don't actually believe in those old superstitions, do you? I'm just trying to help make your day perfect." There it was again, that tone. The one that suggested I was being silly, or difficult, or ungrateful. The tone that had accompanied every major moment of my life since we were children. When I made the honor roll and she threw a tantrum until our parents took us both out for ice cream to celebrate her trying her best. When I got accepted to Oregon State and she suddenly decided she wanted to go there too, despite having her heart set on the University of Southern California for months. When I started dating David and she began showing up at every event we attended, charming his friends and family until they sometimes forgot I was even there. "I know you are," I said carefully, "and I love you for it. But I think David would be disappointed if he didn't get to cut our cake with me." Victoria stood up abruptly, smoothing down her dress. "Of course, I should have thought about David's feelings. You're absolutely right." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I just want everything to be perfect for you today. You deserve that." After she left, I sat on my bed for a long time, staring at the coffee she'd brought me. It smelled wonderful, rich and complex with hints of chocolate and citrus. But something about the conversation left me unsettled. Victoria had been unusually interested in the wedding cake. She'd driven with me to 3 different bakeries for tastings, insisting that we needed to find something absolutely spectacular. She'd even paid for the upgrade to the Swiss buttercream frosting, claiming it was her wedding gift to me. I took a sip of the coffee and tried to push away the uncomfortable feeling in my chest. This was my wedding day. I was marrying the man I loved, surrounded by family and friends who cared about me. Victoria was just being Victoria, wanting to be involved in every detail because that's how she showed love. I needed to stop looking for problems where none existed. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Can't wait to marry you today. Tom and Maria landed safely. They're excited to meet you properly." I smiled, feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. David's sister Maria and her husband General Thomas Rodriguez were flying in from Fort Stevens for the wedding. I'd only met them briefly during a video call 6 months ago, but they seemed warm and genuine. David spoke about Tom with the kind of respect reserved for people who'd earned it through character rather than demanding it through position. He'd served 3 tours overseas, risen through the ranks on merit, and somehow managed to maintain his humanity despite everything he'd seen. David said Tom had a way of reading people that was almost supernatural, a skill that had kept his soldiers alive and made him legendary among his peers. The morning flew by in a blur of hair appointments, makeup touch-ups, and last-minute details. My mother fluttered around the house like an anxious butterfly, adjusting flowers and rearranging place cards that were already perfect. My father retreated to his study with a glass of whiskey and a cigar, his traditional way of dealing with emotional occasions. Victoria disappeared around noon, claiming she needed to check on something at the venue. By 4 o'clock I was standing in the bridal suite at Cascade Valley Country Club, staring at myself in the full-length mirror. My dress was everything I dreamed of since I was a little girl playing princess in my grandmother's attic. Rose Winters had been a successful businesswoman who'd built a chain of flower shops throughout Oregon, before she died when I was 12. She'd left me a trust fund that I'd barely touched, preferring to live on my teacher's salary rather than rely on inherited money. But for my wedding dress I'd splurged. The silk was the color of fresh cream, fitted through the bodice and flowing into a full skirt that moved like water when I walked. The lace sleeves had been hand-sewn by a seamstress in Portland, and tiny pearls caught the light along the neckline. "You look beautiful," Victoria said from behind me. She'd returned from her mysterious errand with perfect timing, as always, absolutely radiant. I turned to smile at her and for a moment, we looked like the sisters we used to be. Before competition crept in, before every achievement became a contest, before love became something that had to be measured and divided rather than multiplied. "Thank you for everything you've done," I said, meaning it. "I know I haven't always been the easiest sister to deal with, but you've made this day magic." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I thought I saw something vulnerable flicker across her face. "You're my little sister," she said softly. "I just want you to be happy." The ceremony was perfect. David looked impossibly handsome in his dress uniform, and when he saw me walking down the aisle, his eyes filled with the kind of love that makes you believe in fairy tales. My father's voice caught when he placed my hand in David's, and I saw my mother wipe away tears during the vow. Even Marcus, who usually looked bored at family events, seemed genuinely moved. General Rodriguez and his wife Maria sat in the front row, and I could see why David respected Tom so much. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but his smile was warm and his handshake gentle when we met after the ceremony. Maria was petite and vivacious, with laugh lines around her eyes and an easy way of making conversation. They both welcomed me to the family with such genuine warmth that I felt like I'd known them for years. The reception began with cocktails on the terrace, overlooking the Willamette Valley. The October sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and string lights twinkled among the oak trees. Victoria moved through the crowd like a gracious hostess, making sure everyone had drinks and introducing herself to David's military friends with just the right balance of interest and respect. She was in her element, charming and beautiful and completely in control. Dinner was served at 7, and I barely tasted the herb-crusted salmon and roasted vegetables that I'd spent weeks selecting. I was too busy accepting congratulations, posing for photos, and trying to memorize every detail of the evening. David held my hand under the table and whispered jokes in my ear that made me laugh despite my nerves. This was everything I'd dreamed of, everything I'd hoped for since the day he proposed on the beach at Lincoln City. As the dinner plates were cleared, Victoria stood up and tapped her champagne glass with her fork. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. She looked absolutely stunning in the soft light of the chandeliers, her blonde hair glowing like a halo. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "For those who don't know me, I'm Victoria Sterling, Natalie's older sister and maid of honor. I've had the privilege of watching Natalie grow from a determined little girl into the amazing woman she is today. She paused, smiling at me across the room. I felt David's hand squeeze mine under the table. Natalie has always been special, even when we were children. She had this way of seeing the good in everyone, of believing that people were fundamentally decent, even when they disappointed her. She's the kind of person who remembers your birthday, who shows up when you need help moving, who listens when you need to talk. She's patient and kind and generous to a fault. Victoria's voice caught slightly, and I felt tears prick my eyes. This was the sister I remembered from childhood, before life got complicated. But what I admire most about Natalie is her loyalty. Once she decides your family forever, she'll protect you, defend you, and love you unconditionally, even when you don't deserve it. Victoria's eyes met mine across the room. David, you're getting someone truly special, someone who will stand by you through anything life throws your way. And Natalie, I hope you know how much you mean to all of us, how much you mean to me. She raised her glass, and the room followed. To Natalie and David, may your marriage be filled with the same love, loyalty, and happiness that Natalie brings to everyone lucky enough to know her. The room erupted in applause and cheer. I wiped away tears, overwhelmed by the emotion in Victoria's voice and the love I felt from everyone around me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Maybe I'd been wrong to worry. Maybe Victoria really was just trying to make my day perfect. The band began playing, and David led me onto the dance floor for our first dance as husband and wife. We'd chosen At Last by Etta James, and as we swayed together under the twinkling lights, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Over David's shoulder I could see our families and friends watching with smiles on their faces. Victoria stood at the edge of the dance floor with Marcus, applauding along with everyone else. After our dance, the evening moved into full celebration mode. The band played a mix of classic hits and contemporary favorites, and the dance floor filled with couples of all ages. I danced with my father, with David's father, with General Rodriguez, who turned out to be surprisingly light on his feet. Victoria pulled me aside during a slow song and hugged me tightly. "I'm so happy for you," she whispered in my ear. "You deserve all of this." As the evening wound toward its end, it was time for the cake-cutting ceremony. The wedding cake was a masterpiece. 3 tiers of vanilla sponge, with Swiss buttercream frosting and fresh flowers cascading down one side. It had cost more than I'd wanted to spend, but Victoria had insisted it needed to be spectacular. "This is the centerpiece of your reception," she'd argued. "People will remember this cake for years." The photographer positioned David and me behind the cake table, and the room gathered around to watch. Victoria appeared at my elbow with the ornate silver cake server that had belonged to our grandmother. "Here," she said, pressing the handle into my palm. "Let me help you get the first slice perfect." Before I could object, she placed her hand over mine on the server and guided it to the bottom tier of the cake. The photographer's flash went off as we made the first cut together, Victoria's radiant smile captured for posterity, alongside my surprised expression. "Now for the traditional first bite," Victoria announced to the room. She carefully lifted the slice we'd cut and placed it on a delicate china plate. "The bride always gets the first taste." She handed me the plate with another brilliant smile, and the room fell quiet in anticipation. This was the moment everyone would remember, the sweet beginning of my married life. I took the silver fork and carved off a small bite of cake, conscious of everyone watching. The cake looked perfect, the layers moist and the frosting silky smooth. I put the fork to my lips and tasted vanilla and butter and something else, something slightly bitter that shouldn't have been there. I swallowed anyway, not wanting to make a scene, and smiled for the photographer. The room erupted in applause, and David leaned over to kiss me as the band began playing again. But as the minutes passed, I began to feel strange. First it was just a slight nausea, the kind that comes from too much excitement and too little food. Then my vision began to blur around the edges, and my hands started to shake. I tried to tell myself it was just wedding nerves, too much champagne, the overwhelming emotion of the day. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I excused myself to the ladies' room, hoping some cold water on my wrists would help me feel better. But as I walked across the reception hall, my steps became unsteady. The room seemed to tilt and sway around me, and the faces of my guests became distorted and strange. "Natalie," David's voice sounded far away, even though he was right beside me. "Are you okay?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. My tongue felt thick and clumsy, and there was a metallic taste spreading across my palate. The nausea intensified, and I felt sweat break out across my forehead despite the cool October air. "I don't feel well," I managed to whisper. David caught my arm as I stumbled, his face creased with concern. "What's wrong? What can I do?" I tried to focus on his face, but everything was spinning now. The chandelier lights above us, seemed to stretch into long streaks of gold, and the sound of the band became muffled and distant. My heart was racing, but at the same time, I felt like I was moving through thick water. "Help!" I whispered, and then my legs gave out beneath me. I hit the floor hard, my wedding dress pooling around me like spilled cream. Vaguely I was aware of screams and shouts, of people rushing toward me, of David calling my name over and over. But I couldn't respond. My body was convulsing, muscles contracting, and releasing beyond my control. Through the chaos, I heard Victoria's voice, high and panicked. "Oh my God, what's happening? Someone call 911. But underneath the panic, I caught something else. Victoria and Marcus, standing just close enough that I could hear them over the commotion. "Well," Marcus said quietly, "that's one problem solved." "Shut up," Victoria hissed back. "Not here." Those were the last words I heard before everything went black. When I woke up, I was in Riverside General Medical Center, connected to more machines than I could count. David was asleep in the chair beside my bed, still wearing his dress uniform but with his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. Sunlight was streaming through the hospital room window, which meant I'd lost an entire night. "David," my voice came out as a croak. He jerked awake immediately, his eyes red-rimmed but alert. "Natalie, thank God, how do you feel?" I took inventory of my body. Weak, shaky, with a headache that felt like someone was driving nails into my skull. "But alive. What happened?" "You were poisoned," David said grimly. "Dr. Bennett ran every test she could think of. They found oleander extract in your system." "Oleander, I knew that Victoria had always loved oleanders, despite the fact that they were toxic. She'd insisted on planting them all around the perimeter of our parents' property when we were teenagers, claiming they were beautiful and deer-resistant. Our father had objected, worried about safety, but Victoria had worn him down with her usual combination of charm and persistence. "How much?" I asked. "Enough to kill you if they hadn't gotten you here in time." Dr. Bennett said another hour and we might have lost you. David's voice broke on the last words. Dr. Claire Bennett, our family physician, and one of my mother's oldest friends, appeared in the doorway as if she'd heard her name. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect silver hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and dark circles under her eyes. "Good to see you awake," she said, checking my chart. "You gave us quite a scare. How's the nausea?" "Better," I said, though everything still felt fragile and uncertain. David said it was oleander. Dr. Bennett nodded grimly. "A significant amount, extracted and concentrated." "This wasn't accidental, Natalie. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." The implications of her words settled over me like a cold blanket. Someone had deliberately tried to kill me on my wedding day. Someone who knew about oleander, who had access to my food, who could extract and concentrate the poison without arousing suspicion. Someone who had insisted on cutting my wedding cake and serving me the first piece personally. "Where's Victoria?" I asked quietly. David and Bennett exchanged a look. "She went home after you were stabilized," David said carefully. "She was very upset. Marcus had to practically carry her out of here." Of course she was upset. Her plan had failed. As if reading my thoughts, Dr. Bennett leaned closer to my "Natalie, the police will want to talk to you when you're feeling stronger. Detective Morrison is handling the case. He'll need to know everything you remember about last night." I nodded, but my mind was already racing ahead. If Victoria had tried to kill me once, what would stop her from trying again? And next time, she might be more careful, more thorough. Next time, there might not be a Dr. Bennett to save me. "There's something else," David said hesitantly. "Tom wants to see you when you're up for visitors. He's been here all night, making some phone calls." General Rodriguez. I'd almost forgotten about him in the chaos of everything else. What kind of phone calls would an army general make about a poisoning case? "Send him in." Something told me I was going to need all the allies I could get. General Thomas Rodriguez entered my hospital room, with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to walking into dangerous situations. He was taller than I'd expected, with steel gray hair cut in a precise military style, and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room before settling on me. Despite having been up all night, his uniform was crisp and his bearing erect. This was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. "Mrs. Chen," he said formally, then caught himself. "Natalie, how are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I admitted, struggling to sit up straighter in the hospital bed. "But alive thanks to Dr. Bennett and the paramedics." Tom pulled the visitor's chair closer to my bed and sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I need to ask you some questions, if you're up for it. I've been in contact with Detective Morrison, and there are some things about last night that don't add up. David squeezed my hand. Tom has experience with unusual situations. He thinks there might be more to this than a simple poisoning. What kind of experience? I asked. Tom's expression remained neutral, but I caught something flicker in his eyes. I've spent 23 years in the army, including 3 tours in Afghanistan. I've seen what people are capable of when they want something badly enough. I've also learned to recognize patterns that others might miss. He pulled out a small notebook, the kind with a black leather cover that looked like it had seen plenty of use. Tell me about your relationship with your sister. The question caught me off guard. I'd expected him to ask about the cake, or who had access to it, or whether I'd noticed anything unusual about the taste. What does Victoria have to do with this? Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Humor me. I looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. Something about Tom's steady presence made me feel safe, like I could tell him things I'd never admitted to anyone else. Victoria and I have always been complicated, I began slowly. She's 3 years older, and she's always been the golden child. Beautiful, charismatic, successful at everything she tries. Growing up, I was the quiet one, the studious one, the one who stayed in the background while Victoria shone. Tom made a note in his book. Did she resent your achievements? What achievements? I laughed bitterly. Victoria was homecoming queen, student body president, graduated summa cum laude from Oregon State. She married Marcus, who's wealthy and handsome and treats her like a trophy. I became a middle school teacher, and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment until 6 months ago. But you inherited your grandmother's trust fund, Tom said quietly. I stared at him. How did you know about that? David mentioned it last night while we were waiting for you to wake up. He said you rarely talk about it, that you prefer to live on your teaching salary. Because I didn't earn it, I said. Grandma Rose left it to me because she thought I was the one who would use it responsibly, but I always felt guilty about that. Victoria was the one who helped her in the flower shops every summer. Victoria was the one who studied business in college. It should have gone to her. Tom leaned forward slightly. How much are we talking about? I'm not comfortable discussing specific numbers, I said carefully. Ballpark. Enough to matter, I hesitated, then nodded. Enough to change someone's life. Grandma Rose was very successful, and she invested wisely. The trust has grown significantly over the years. Tom made another note. Did Victoria know about the inheritance? Not the full extent of it. She knew Grandma Rose left me some money, but I've never told anyone exactly how much. Not even David until we got engaged. What about Marcus? The question hung in the air between us. Marcus Sterling was a real estate developer who specialized in luxury properties around Portland. He lived well, but I'd always suspected he was the kind of person who spent every penny he made trying to maintain an image. Victoria's taste for expensive things certainly didn't help their bottom line. I don't know, I said finally. Victoria might have told him something, but I doubt she knows the real numbers. Tom closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. Natalie, I want you to think carefully about the past few months. Has Victoria's behavior toward you changed at all? Has she been more interested in your financial situation, your relationship with David, your future plans? As he spoke, memories began surfacing that I'd pushed aside at the time. Victoria insisting on helping with the wedding planning, despite having no real experience with event coordination. Her sudden interest in getting to know David's family, particularly his military connections. The way she'd quizzed me about my plans for the trust fund after I got married. She's been more involved in my life lately, I admitted, but I thought it was because she wanted to be supported. She said she felt bad about not being a better sister when we were younger. And you believed her? I wanted to believe her. The truth of that statement hit me like a physical blow. She's my sister. Despite everything, I love her. I thought maybe getting married was giving us a chance to start fresh. Tom nodded understandingly. Family loyalty can be a weakness as much as a strength. It makes us vulnerable to people who know how to exploit it. Dr. Bennett appeared in the doorway, carrying a fresh set of test results. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to see this, General Rodriguez. She handed him a manila folder, and Tom scanned the contents quickly. His expression darkened as he read. What is it? David asked. The toxicology report, Dr. Bennett said grimly. The oleander extract in Natalie's system wasn't just concentrated. It was refined using a sophisticated extraction process that requires specialized knowledge and equipment. Tom looked up from the report. This wasn't someone crushing up flowers in their kitchen. This was done by someone who understands chemistry and has access to professional-grade equipment. My mind raced back to Victoria's college years. She'd started as a business major, but she'd taken several chemistry courses as elective. She'd even worked in a lab during her junior year, helping a professor with research on plant-based compounds. I'd forgotten about that until now. Victoria studied chemistry in college, I said quietly. She worked in a research lab for almost a year. Tom and Bennett exchanged a significant look. What kind of research? Dr. Bennett asked. Something about extracting active compounds from plants for pharmaceutical use. She used to complain about how tedious the extraction process was, how many steps were involved in getting pure compound. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of my heart monitor. The implications of what I'd just revealed hung heavy in the air. There's something else, Tom said after a long moment. I made some calls last night to colleagues who specialize in forensic investigation. The timing of your collapse was very specific. Oleander poisoning usually takes longer to manifest symptoms, but the refined extract you ingested was designed to act quickly and dramatically. What does that mean? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. It means whoever did this wanted you to collapse publicly, in front of all your wedding guests. They wanted it to look like a medical emergency, sudden and tragic. If you died, it would have appeared to be a heart attack or an allergic reaction. David's grip on my hand tightened. Why would someone want that? Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying his notes. Because a public collapse would generate immediate sympathy for the grieving family. No one would question their right to handle the funeral arrangements, to manage the victims' affairs, to access their financial accounts during the emergency. The full scope of what he was suggesting hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just an attempt on my life. It was a carefully planned scheme to murder me in a way that would give Victoria immediate access to my inheritance. You think Victoria was trying to kill me for the trust fund? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I think someone with knowledge of chemistry, access to your food, and a strong financial motive tried to murder you in a way that would maximize their benefit from your death, Tom said carefully. I can't prove it yet, but the pattern is consistent with what I've seen in other cases. The phrase made my blood run cold. What kind of other cases? Tom hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I've consulted on several military cases involving poisoning and financial fraud, usually involving soldiers who died under suspicious circumstances, leaving behind substantial life insurance policies or death benefits. The perpetrators are often family members who understand the victim's financial situation and have access to their food or medication. And you caught, eventually, but it required careful investigation and solid evidence. Accusations like this destroy families, even when they're true. We need to be absolutely certain before we move forward. Dr. Bennett cleared her throat. There is one more. The blood work showed that Natalie had been exposed to small amounts of oleander over several weeks before the wedding. Not enough to cause symptoms, but enough to build up in her system. The room spun around me. Someone's been slowly poisoning me. It's possible. Or you've been exposed to oleander through some other means. Do you spend time around the plants? Handle them directly. I shook my head. I'm allergic to most plants. I avoid gardening completely. The only time I'm around oleander is when I visit my parents' house, and Victoria planted those years ago. Tom made another note. How often do you visit your parents? Once or twice a week for dinner. Victoria usually cooks. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Oh, she's been poisoning me gradually. We don't know that for certain, Tom said quickly. But it's a possibility we need to investigate. Why? David's voice was raw with emotion. Why would she do this? I closed my eyes, trying to process everything I'd learned. My sister, who I'd loved and admired and envied in equal measure, had been systematically poisoning me for weeks. She'd planned my murder for my wedding day, timing it to maximize her access to my inheritance. She'd sat beside my hospital bed, crying crocodile tears, while secretly disappointed that her plan had failed. Because she's always believed she deserved everything I had, I said finally. The trust fund, the recognition, the love. In her mind I stole what was rightfully hers. Tom closed his notebook and stood up. I'm going to make some more calls. There are people who owe me favors, people who can investigate this quietly without alerting Victoria that we're onto her. What do I do in the meantime? I asked. You recover, you stay alert. And you don't eat or drink anything that Victoria has had access to. His expression was grim. If I'm right about this, she's not going to give up just because the first attempt failed. She'll try again, and next time she'll be more careful. After Tom left, David and I sat in silence for a long time. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window, making everything look deceptively peaceful. Outside, people were going about their normal Sunday routines, unaware that my entire world had been turned upside down. I can't stay here, I said finally. Dr. Bennett wants to keep you for observation for at least another day, David protested. No, I mean I can't stay in Riverside. If Victoria really is trying to kill me, I'm a sitting duck here. She knows everyone. She has access to everything. She could walk into this hospital right now and no one would question her right to visit her sick sister. David was quiet for a moment, considering. Where would you go? I don't know. Somewhere she can't find me. Somewhere I can think clearly and figure out what to do next. What about the police? Shouldn't we report this to Detective Morrison? I shook my head. With what evidence? Tom's suspicions. The fact that I'm having paranoid thoughts about my sister after nearly dying. Morrison will think I'm having some kind of psychological breakdown from the trauma. But if Tom's right, then Victoria is smart enough to have covered her tracks. She's had weeks to plan this, David. She's not going to leave obvious evidence lying around. A soft knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Maria Rodriguez peeked her head in, carrying a large bouquet of flowers and a concerned expression. I hope I'm not intruding, she said softly. I wanted to check on you and bring you something to brighten up this sterile room. Come in, I said, grateful for the distraction. Thank you for the flowers. They're beautiful. Maria arranged the bouquet in the water pitcher on my bedside table, her movements efficient and practiced. Tom told me about his concerns. I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We're going to help you figure out what's happening. You barely know me, I protested. This isn't your problem. Maria sat down in the chair Tom had vacated, her dark eyes serious. Natalie, I've been married to a military man for 15 years. I've learned to trust his instincts about people and situations. If Tom thinks you're in danger, then you're in danger. And if you're in danger, then you're family, and we protect family. Her words brought tears to my eyes. I'd spent so many years feeling isolated, caught between my love for Victoria and my fear of her jealousy. The idea that these people I barely knew were willing to stand by me was overwhelming. What do you think I should do? I asked. Maria glanced at David, then back at me. I think you should disappear for a while. Let Tom do his investigation without Victoria knowing your suspicion. Give him time to gather evidence. Where would I go? We have a cabin in the Cascade Mountains, about 2 hours from here. It's remote, private, and Victoria would never think to look for you there. You could recover in peace, while Tom works. David frowned. I don't like the idea of Natalie being alone and isolated. She wouldn't be alone, Maria said firmly. I'll stay with her. Tom can visit when he has updates, and we'll have satellite communication in case of emergencies. The idea was a chance to get away from everything. To think clearly without worrying about Victoria showing up unexpectedly. Time to process what had happened and figure out my next move. What about my job? I'm supposed to be back at school in 2 days. You're recovering from poisoning, Maria pointed out. I'm sure your principal will understand if you need extended medical leave. And what do we tell Victoria? David and Maria exchanged a look. We tell her you're too weak to see visitors, David said, that you need complete rest and quiet. It'll buy us some time. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what Victoria was doing right now. Was she at home, pacing and worrying about whether I remembered anything from the wedding? Was she planning her next move? Was she wondering why I wasn't dead yet? Okay, I said finally. Let's do it. The plan came together quickly. Dr. Bennett would discharge me that evening, citing my need for rest and recovery in a controlled environment. David would drive me to the cabin, making sure we weren't followed. Maria would meet us there with supplies and stay as long as needed. Tom would continue his investigation from Fort Stevens, using his military contacts to dig into Victoria's background and activities. As the day wore on, I found myself watching the door nervously, expecting Victoria to appear at any moment with flowers and tears and fake concern. But she didn't come. According to David, she'd called twice to check on my condition, but she hadn't asked to visit. That struck me as odd. The old Victoria would have been here constantly, fussing over me and making sure everyone knew what a devoted sister she was. Maybe she was afraid to face me. Maybe she was worried that I might remember something from the wedding that would incriminate her. Or maybe she was simply waiting for a better opportunity to finish what she'd started. Dr. Bennett returned around dinner time with discharge papers and a serious expression. Your blood work is improving, but you're still weak. I want you to take it easy for at least a week. No stress, no physical exertion, and absolutely no alcohol or unusual foods until your system is completely clear. How long before the oleander is completely out of my system? Another few days for the acute effects, but it can take weeks for all traces to disappear. The good news is that once it's gone, it's gone. Oleander doesn't cause permanent damage if you survive the initial poisoning. And if someone wanted to try again, Dr. Bennett's expression darkened. They'd have to use a much larger dose to be effective, now that your body has some resistance. But Natalie, if someone really is trying to hurt you, oleander might not be their only option. You need to be very, very careful. As the sun set over Riverside, David helped me into his truck and we drove away from the hospital. I watched the familiar streets of my hometown disappear in the rearview mirror, wondering if I'd ever feel safe here again. We stopped at my apartment briefly so I could pack some clothes and personal items, but David insisted on going in first to make sure it was safe. Everything looks normal, he reported, but he stayed close to me the entire time I was packing. The drive to the cabin took us through winding mountain roads that climbed steadily into the Cascades. The October night was clear and cold, with stars visible between the evergreen branches overhead. David kept checking his mirrors, but there were no other cars on the remote highway. The cabin was everything Maria had promised. Rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a well-equipped kitchen, and a porch that overlooked a small mountain lake. More importantly, it was isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only access road was clearly visible from the main windows. Maria was waiting for us with groceries, firewood and a satellite phone. I've already swept the place for any surveillance devices, she said matter-of-factly, clean as a whistle. You know how to sweep for surveillance devices? I asked, surprised. Maria smiled. 15 years as a military wife teaches you all sorts of useful skills. Tom insisted I learn basic security protocols after his first deployment. As David prepared to leave, I felt a surge of panic. What if Victoria realizes I'm not at the hospital? What if she comes looking for me? Then she'll find an empty apartment and a lot of unanswered questions, David said, pulling me into his arms. Maria's right. You need time to recover and think. I'll be back tomorrow evening with updates from Tom. After David left, Maria and I sat by the fireplace with cups of herbal tea, watching the flames dance in the stone hearth. The silence was profound after months of wedding planning stress and the chaos of the past 24 hours. Can I ask you something? I said finally. Of course. Why are you and Tom willing to help me? You don't even know me. Maria was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When Tom and I first got married, his family didn't approve of me. I was too young, too Hispanic, too different from what they'd imagined for their golden boy. His sister Rebecca was particularly nasty. She'd smile to my face and then make little comments designed to undermine my confidence. She took a sip of her tea, her expression distant with memory. It took me years to realize that Rebecca wasn't trying to protect Tom from making a mistake. She was jealous that he'd found someone who loved him for who he was, not what he could provide. Some people can't stand to see others happy, especially when they feel like happiness is a limited resource. What happened with Rebecca? Tom finally saw through her manipulations when she tried to sabotage our 5th anniversary party. She'd convinced several family members that I was having an affair, complete with fabricated evidence. When the truth came out, Tom cut ties with her completely. Maria looked at me directly. Family loyalty is important, but it shouldn't be a suicide pact. Sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones who hurt us the worst, because they know exactly where we're vulnerable. Her words resonated deep. I'd spent so many years making excuses for Victoria's behavior, attributing her cruelty to competition or insecurity, rather than malice. I'd wanted so desperately to have a loving relationship with my sister, that I'd ignored every warning sign. How did you know when to stop trying? I asked. When I realized that I was sacrificing my own well-being to maintain a relationship with someone who didn't actually want a relationship with me. She wanted a target, someone to blame for her own unhappiness. Once I understood that, it became easier to protect myself. We talked long into the night, and for the first time in years I felt like someone truly understood the complexity of my situation with Victoria. Maria didn't judge me for loving my sister despite everything, but she also didn't try to convince me that Victoria's behavior was somehow my fault. As I finally settled into the comfortable guest bed, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the mountain forest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Maybe I could survive this. Maybe I could figure out a way to protect myself without destroying what was left of my family. But first I needed to know the truth about what Victoria had done and why, and thanks to General Rodriguez's investigation, I might finally get some answers. 3 days into my retreat at the mountain cabin, Tom arrived with a thick manila folder and an expression that told me he'd found what we'd all been dreading. Maria was in the kitchen preparing lunch when his military truck pulled up the winding gravel drive, and I watched from the living room window as he sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, collecting himself before getting out. "Natalie," he said when Maria let him in, his voice carrying the weight of bad news. "We need to talk." Maria poured coffee while Tom spread documents across the rustic dining table: bank statements, credit reports, laboratory records, and what looked like surveillance photos. The evidence of my sister's betrayal laid out in neat, organized piles like a case file for court. "I'll start with the financial motive," Tom said, settling into his chair with military precision. "Victoria and Marcus are in serious debt, not just credit card bills or a mortgage they can't afford. We're talking about the kind of financial trouble that destroys lives." He pulled out a credit report with Victoria's name at the top. The numbers were staggering: 6-figure credit card debt, a second mortgage on their house, loans against Marcus's business that were already in default, car payments, country club fees, and luxury purchases that painted a picture of people living far beyond their means. "How did you get access to this?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I have friends in various government agencies who owe me favors," Tom said diplomatically. "Let's leave it at that." Maria set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. "How much do they owe?" "Combined, nearly $800,000. Marcus's real estate business has been struggling for 2 years, but they've maintained their lifestyle by borrowing against projected future earnings that never materialized." I stared at the papers, trying to process the magnitude of what Tom was telling me. $800,000. No wonder Victoria had been so interested in my inheritance lately. She wasn't just greedy, she was desperate. "There's more," Tom continued, pulling out a different set of documents. "I had a contact at the State Department run background checks on both of them. Marcus has been investigated twice for insurance fraud, though charges were never filed. And Victoria," he paused, looking directly at me, "Victoria has been researching oleander extraction methods for months." He slid a printout across the table: internet search histories, library checkout records, and purchase receipts for chemistry equipment. Victoria had been planning this for a long time, learning everything she could about the poison that would eventually end up in my wedding cake. "She bought a professional-grade extraction kit 6 weeks before your wedding," Tom said quietly. "Paid cash, used a fake name, but the security camera at the scientific supply store got a clear image of her face." Maria leaned over my shoulder to look at the photograph. It was definitely Victoria, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, but unmistakably my sister. She was loading a large cardboard box into the trunk of her BMW, the same car she'd driven to my wedding. "She planned to murder me," I said, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. "My own sister planned to kill me for money." "It gets worse," Tom said grimly. "I had Detective Morrison quietly test the leftover food from your wedding reception. Every dish Victoria helped prepare showed traces of oleander, but in concentrations too small to be detected by normal food safety protocols." The room tilted around me. "She poisoned all the food?" "No, just the dishes she knew you'd eat. Your dinner plate, the champagne toast, and of course the wedding cake. She'd been gradually building up the toxin in your system for weeks through family dinners, and the wedding was supposed to be the final fatal dose." I thought back to all those Sunday dinners at my parents' house, Victoria insisting on cooking my favorite meals, always making sure I had seconds of everything. She'd been slowly killing me with kindness, literally. "What about Marcus?" Maria asked. "Was he involved?" Tom nodded. "Based on what we found, this was a joint effort. Marcus handled the financial research, figuring out exactly how much your trust fund was worth and how they could access it after your death. Victoria handled the poison." He pulled out another document, this one with legal letterhead. They'd already consulted with an estate attorney about inheritance laws for surviving spouses. Since you and David were married, he would have inherited your personal assets, but Victoria was counting on his grief and military deployment schedule to give her control over the trust fund as your closest blood relative. They researched inheritance law. I felt sick to my stomach. Extensively, they knew exactly what they were doing. Natalie, this wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of greed. This was premeditated murder for financial gain. Maria moved to the window, staring out at the peaceful mountain lake. What's the legal situation? Can we have them arrested? Tom's expression darkened. That's where things get complicated. We have circumstantial evidence, but nothing that would guarantee a conviction. A good defense attorney could argue that all of this is coincidence, that Victoria's research was academic curiosity, that the debt was manageable. What about the poison in the food? I asked. Chain of custody issues. The reception hall disposed of most of the leftover food before we thought to test it. What we recovered had been sitting in a dumpster for days, contaminated by other garbage. A defense attorney could argue that the oleander traces came from environmental contamination. I stared at the evidence spread across the table, everything we needed to prove Victoria's guilt, but nothing that would hold up in court against a skilled lawyer. She'd been smart covering her tracks at every step, so she gets away with it. The thought made me feel hollow inside. Not necessarily, Tom said carefully, but we need more evidence, something that definitively ties Victoria to the poisoning attempt. Like what? A confession would be ideal, or catching her in the act of trying again. The suggestion hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. I would have to put myself at risk to catch my sister in another murder attempt. Absolutely not, Maria said firmly. We're not using Natalie as bait. I'm not suggesting we put her in danger, Tom replied. But if Victoria thinks her first attempt failed because of bad luck rather than discovery, she might try again, and next time we'll be ready. David's truck pulled up outside, interrupting our conversation. He'd been driving up from Riverside every evening with updates and supplies, playing the role of the concerned husband while secretly coordinating with Tom's investigation. How's our patient today? He asked as he entered, kissing my forehead and settling into the chair beside me. Then he saw the documents on the table. Jesus, you found it all, didn't you? Tom nodded grimly. More than enough to know what happened, not quite enough to prove it in court. David scanned the financial records, his jaw tightening as he read, $800,000. No wonder Victoria's been so interested in your inheritance. There's something else, Tom said, pulling out his phone. I've been monitoring Victoria's communications through a contact at the phone company. She's been making calls to some interesting people. He played an audio file, and Victoria's voice filled the quiet cabin. She was talking to someone about life insurance policies, asking detailed questions about payouts for accidental death versus natural causes. When was this recorded? I asked. Yesterday morning. She's not giving up, Natalie. She's already planning her next move. The sound of my sister's voice, calm and calculating as she discussed my potential death, made me feel physically ill. This was the woman who'd held me when I cried after my first heartbreak, who'd taught me to drive in the empty parking lot behind our high school, who'd been my maid of honor just 4 days ago. I need some air, I said, standing abruptly and walking onto the cabin's front porch. The mountain evening was crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. I sat on the wooden steps, trying to process everything I'd learned. My sister had been systematically poisoning me for weeks, planning my murder down to the smallest detail, all for money that I would have gladly shared with her if she'd simply asked. David joined me on the porch, settling beside me without speaking. Sometimes the best comfort is just presence, and after 12 years together, he understood that I needed time to think rather than platitudes about everything being okay. She could have just talked to me, I said finally. If she was in financial trouble, I would have. I've always helped her. I know, David said softly, but I don't think this was ever really about the money. I think it was about control, about proving to herself that she was smarter and more deserving than everyone else. How can you be so calm about this? Someone tried to murder your wife. David was quiet for a long moment. Because being angry won't help us catch her, and because Tom has a plan. I turned to look at him. What kind of plan? The kind that requires you to trust us completely and follow orders without question. Back inside the cabin, Tom was spreading out what looked like architectural drawings on the table. Maria was studying them intently, occasionally pointing to specific areas and asking questions. What's all this? I asked. Your parents' house, Tom replied. I had a contact in the city planning office pull the original blueprints. If Victoria tries again, it'll probably be there. Familiar territory, controlled environment, easy access to your food and drink. He pointed to various rooms on the plans. The kitchen has 2 entrances, here and the dining room has sightlines to 3 different rooms. If we position surveillance equipment correctly, we can monitor everything Victoria does without her knowing. You want to set up cameras in my parents' house? With their permission, yes. Your father already agreed when David explained the situation. I stared at him. My parents know. David nodded. We had to tell them. They needed to understand why you'd disappeared from the hospital, and why Victoria might be dangerous. How did they take it? About as well as you'd expect. Your mother cried for an hour. Your father wanted to drive straight to Victoria's house and confront her immediately. It took some convincing to get them to go along with Tom's plan instead. Tom pulled out another document. Here's what we're thinking. You'll return home tomorrow, officially recovered from your poisoning. We'll announce that you're feeling much better and invite Victoria to a family dinner to celebrate your recovery.
And then what? Then we watch her very carefully.
Every move she makes, every ingredient she handles, every moment she's alone with your food or drink. If she tries to poison you again, we'll have video evidence that will hold up in court. Maria frowned. What if she doesn't take the bait? What if she's too suspicious? Then we try a different approach, Tom said. But my read on Victoria is that she's arrogant. She thinks she's smarter than everyone else, and she thinks her first attempt failed due to bad luck rather than discovery. That kind of personality rarely resists the chance to prove their superiority. The plan was risky, but it was also our best chance to get the evidence we needed. I would have to sit across the dinner table from my sister, knowing she was trying to kill me, and pretend that everything was normal. What about the actual poison? I asked. I can't actually eat whatever she prepares. Tom smiled grimly. That's where military training comes in handy. I'll be monitoring everything from a surveillance van parked down the street. The moment Victoria adds anything suspicious to your food, I'll alert you through a hidden earpiece. You'll excuse yourself from the table, and we'll have our evidence. And if something goes wrong, Dr. Bennett will be standing by at the hospital with every antidote and treatment protocol available. Plus, we'll have the exact poison and dosage on video, so she'll know exactly how to counteract it. The plan was elaborate and dangerous, but it was also the only way to stop Victoria before she tried again. Because Tom was right about one thing, my sister wasn't going to give up. She was in too deep financially, and she'd already crossed the line from sibling rivalry to attempted murder. When do we do this? I asked. Tomorrow night, Sunday dinner, just like old times. Your parents will invite Victoria and Marcus, mentioning that you're feeling much better and want to celebrate with family. I spent the rest of the evening memorizing the details of Tom's plan, where the cameras would be positioned, how the communication system would work, what signals to watch for from the surveillance team. It felt surreal, preparing for a covert operation in my childhood home against my own sister. That night, as I lay in the guest bed listening to the wind in the pine trees outside, I thought about all the Sunday dinners Victoria and I had shared growing up, the elaborate meals she'd prepare to impress our parents, the way she'd always make sure I had seconds of dessert, the sister talks we'd have while doing dishes afterward. How many of those memories were real, and how many were just Victoria manipulating me for reasons I'd never understood? Had she ever actually loved me, or had I always been just an obstacle to what she thought she deserved? By morning I'd made peace with what we had to do. Victoria had made her choice when she decided to poison my wedding cake. Now it was time to face the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. Tom arrived early with surveillance equipment and a detailed timeline for the operation. David helped him install tiny cameras throughout my parents' house while I rehearsed my role as the unsuspecting victim. Maria coached me on how to act natural while wearing a hidden microphone and earpiece. Remember, Tom said as we reviewed the plan one final time, your safety is the priority. If anything feels wrong, if Victoria does anything unexpected, you get out of that house immediately. We can always try again, but if something happens, Victoria wins. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, I drove back to Riverside for the first time since my wedding night. The familiar streets looked different somehow, more threatening than comforting. Every shadow could hide danger. Every familiar face could be an enemy. My parents' house sat on a quiet residential street lined with maple trees and well-maintained lawns. It looked exactly the same as it had my entire life, white clapboard siding with green shutters and my mother's carefully tended flower bed. But now I knew that somewhere in those flower beds were the oleander plants Victoria had insisted on planting years ago, the source of the poison that had nearly killed me. Victoria's BMW was already parked in the driveway when I arrived. Through the living room window, I could see her helping my mother in the kitchen, laughing at something and looking completely relaxed. The picture of a devoted daughter and sister, not a woman who'd tried to commit murder just 4 days ago. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering my courage. In my ear, Tom's voice was calm and reassuring. "We're in position, cameras are active, audio is clear. You've got this, Natalie." Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car and walked toward the front door. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine whether Victoria faced justice for what she'd done, or whether she'd be free to try again. The front door opened before I could knock, and my mother pulled me into a fierce hug. She looked older than she had a week ago, with worry lines around her eyes and a fragility I'd never noticed before. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" she asked, holding me at arm's length to study my face. "Much better," I said loud enough for Victoria to hear from the kitchen. "Ready to get back to normal life." Victoria appeared in the doorway, wearing an apron over her designer dress, and a smile that looked completely genuine. "Natalie, you look wonderful. I'm so glad you're feeling better." She hugged me tightly, and I had to force myself not to recoil from her touch. This was the woman who'd spent weeks slowly poisoning me, who'd refined oleander extract specifically to kill me on my wedding day. And yet her embrace felt exactly the same as it always had, warm and familiar and sisterly. "I've been so worried about you," Victoria continued, stepping back to look at me with apparent concern. "When you collapsed at the reception, I thought we might lose you." The sincerity in her voice was chilling. Either Victoria was a better actress than I'd ever imagined, or she'd somehow convinced herself that she hadn't actually tried to murder me. "Thank goodness for Dr. Bennett. She said it was probably just exhaustion and dehydration from all the wedding stress." Victoria nodded sympathetically. "Wedding planning is so overwhelming. I should have insisted you take better care of yourself." Marcus emerged from the living room, where he'd been talking with my father about football. He kissed my cheek politely and asked about my recovery, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was studying me, probably wondering if I suspected anything. "Dinner's almost ready," my mother announced. "Victoria's been cooking all afternoon. She wanted everything to be perfect for your homecoming meal." Of course she had. Victoria had been in the kitchen for hours, with unlimited access to every ingredient and utensil. If she was going to try again, this would be the perfect opportunity. "I made all your favorites," Victoria said, leading me toward the dining room. "Herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, and that chocolate mousse you love. The same menu from my rehearsal dinner 2 weeks ago." Victoria had paid attention to what I'd enjoyed most, probably planning even then how she would use my favorite foods against me. In my ear, Tom's voice was steady and professional. "Kitchen camera shows Victoria adding something to your plate specific. Can't see exactly what, but her movements were deliberate and concealed from the other family members." My heart started racing, but I forced myself to smile and compliment Victoria on how delicious everything looked. This was it, the moment we'd been waiting for. Victoria was making her second attempt at murder, and this time we were ready. The question was whether I'd survive long enough to see her arrested for it. The salmon on my plate looked perfect, garnished with fresh dill and lemon slices, just the way Victoria knew I liked it. Steam rose from the herb crust, filling the dining room with the aroma of rosemary and thyme. Under normal circumstances, it would have been exactly the kind of comfort meal I craved after a traumatic experience. But knowing that my sister had deliberately added poison to my portion made my stomach turn. "Eat up while it's hot," Victoria encouraged, settling into her chair across from me with her own plate. "I used that spice blend you complimented at Christmas dinner last year." I picked up my fork, aware that everyone at the table was watching me. My parents looked anxious, probably wondering if I was strong enough for a full family meal so soon after being hospitalized. Marcus seemed distracted, checking his phone periodically and barely touching his food. Victoria watched me with bright, attentive eyes, like a scientist observing an experiment. In my earpiece, Tom's voice was calm but urgent. "Don't take that bite, Natalie." Kitchen camera caught Victoria adding a white powder to your salmon, while the others were in the living room. She was very careful to keep her back to the general camera angles, but we got it. I set down my fork and reached for my water glass instead, buying time to think. "This looks amazing, Victoria. You've really outdone yourself." "I wanted tonight to be special," she replied, cutting into her own salmon with delicate precision. "After everything that happened at the wedding, I thought we could use a nice quiet family evening." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. Victoria was the reason we couldn't have nice quiet family evenings anymore. She was the storm that had shattered our family's peace, even if our parents didn't know it yet. "You're not eating," my mother observed, looking at my untouched plate with concern. "Are you still feeling nauseous?" "Just a little," I lied, My appetite hasn't completely returned yet. Dr. Bennett said that was normal after what I went through. Victoria's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment, but she covered it quickly with sisterly concern. Of course, you poor thing. Maybe you should start with something lighter. I made that butternut squash soup you love. She started to stand, offering to bring me a bowl from the kitchen, but I quickly shook my head. No, don't trouble yourself. I'll try a few bites of the salmon. It really does smell wonderful. Tom's voice crackled in my ear again. Stall as long as you can. We need her to make more obvious moves before we can act. I cut a small piece of salmon and lifted it toward my mouth, then paused as if struck by a sudden thought. Victoria, didn't you used to have that beautiful herb garden behind your apartment in college? I remember you talking about growing your own seasonings. Her eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Oh yes, I loved that little garden. I grew everything from basil to lavender. There's something so satisfying about cooking with herbs you've cultivated yourself. What else did you grow? I asked, setting my fork down again as if completely absorbed in the conversation. Let's see. There was rosemary, thyme, oregano. She ticked off the herbs on her fingers, warming to the subject. I even had some more unusual plants. Foxglove for the beautiful flowers, castor beans for their interesting leaves, and those lovely oleanders that bloom all summer long. My blood ran cold. She was listing poisonous plants like they were perfectly normal additions to a culinary herb garden. Either Victoria was incredibly naive about botany, or she was taunting me. Oleanders in an herb garden, my father interjected with a frown. Aren't those toxic? Victoria waved dismissively. Only if you're foolish enough to eat them, Dad. They're perfectly safe as ornamental plants. Besides, the flowers are so beautiful, and they're incredibly hardy. I actually helped plant some around your property line, remember? I remember you insisting on it despite our concerns, my mother said quietly. The conversation was veering into dangerous territory. I could see Victoria starting to realize that her casual mention of poisonous plants might not have been wise. Her smile became slightly forced, and she glanced around the table as if gauging everyone's reactions. Anyway, she said brightly, that was years ago. These days I barely have time to keep houseplants alive, let alone maintain a garden. I knew that was a lot. Tom's surveillance had revealed that Victoria had been visiting garden centers regularly over the past few months, purchasing various botanical supplies under different names. She'd maintained her interest in dangerous plants well into adulthood. Marcus cleared his throat, apparently sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. Maybe we should talk about something more cheerful. Natalie, have you and David given any thought to where you'll honeymoon once you're feeling better? We haven't really discussed it yet, I replied honestly. Everything's been so overwhelming. You should go somewhere tropical, Victoria suggested. Somewhere you can relax completely and forget all about the stress of the past week. The way she said it made me wonder if she was hoping I'd leave town soon, perhaps permanently. If her second poisoning attempt succeeded, there wouldn't be any need for a honeymoon trip. Tom's voice buzzed in my ear. She's getting nervous, her body language is changing, becoming more defensive. We need to push a little harder. I took a deep breath and decided to take a calculated risk. Dr. Bennett mentioned something interesting about my poisoning symptoms. She said the oleander toxin in my system had been building up for weeks, not just from the wedding day exposure. The effect of my words was immediate and dramatic. Victoria's fork clattered against her plate, and she reached quickly for her wine glass to cover her startled reaction. Marcus went completely still, his eyes fixed on his wife with an expression of barely controlled panic. What are you saying? Victoria asked, her voice slightly higher than normal. I'm saying that someone had been poisoning me gradually for quite some time before the wedding, I continued, watching her face carefully. Bennett thinks it might have been happening during family dinners, maybe in food that was prepared specifically for me. My father set down his silverware with a sharp clink. Are you suggesting that someone in this family has been deliberately poisoning you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's face had gone pale, but she rallied quickly, summoning that same bright smile she'd perfected over the years. That's ridiculous, she said with a laugh that sounded forced. Who would do such a thing? We all love Natalie. The idea that any of us would hurt her is absurd. Is it? I asked quietly. Someone with access to my food, someone who knew about oleander toxicity, someone who had the chemistry knowledge to extract and concentrate the poison. It would have to be someone close to me. Marcus pushed back from the table abruptly. I think we should go, he said to Victoria. This conversation is getting out of hand. No, my father said firmly. I think we need to hear what Natalie has to say. Victoria looked trapped, her usual composure cracking under the pressure. Natalie, you're obviously still traumatized from what happened. You're seeing threats where none exist. Maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist or counselor, who can help you process this properly. It was a clever deflection, trying to make me seem paranoid and unstable. But I could see in her eyes that she knew her secret was out. The question was how far she'd go to protect herself. I have been talking to someone, I said calmly. Several someones actually, including Detective Morrison and General Rodriguez. Victoria's mask slipped completely for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Then she composed herself again, but the damage was done. Everyone at the table had seen the real Victoria Sterling, and she knew it. What exactly are you accusing me of? She asked, her voice deadly quiet. I'm not accusing you of anything, I replied. I'm simply sharing what the investigators found. The evidence speaks for itself. At that moment, Tom's voice came through my earpiece with military precision. We're moving in now. Get away from the table and get outside. This is about to get very loud. I stood up from my chair, my movements casual but deliberate. I think I need some fresh air. All this talk about poison is making me feel queasy again. As I walked toward the front door, I heard the sound of vehicles pulling into the driveway, car doors slamming, footsteps on the front walkway, and then Tom's authoritative voice calling out, Riverside Police Department, we have a warrant. The front door opened before anyone could answer it, and Detective Morrison entered with Tom close behind. They were followed by 2 uniformed officers and a crime scene technician carrying video equipment. Victoria Sterling, Detective Morrison announced. You're under arrest for attempted murder. The dining room erupted in chaos. My mother screamed, my father jumped to his feet demanding explanations, and Marcus began shouting about harassment and false accusation. But Victoria herself went completely still, staring at me with an expression of pure hatred. You bitch, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. You ungrateful, selfish bitch. Ma'am, you need to remain silent, Detective Morrison warned as one of the officers moved to handcuff Victoria. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. But Victoria was beyond caring about legal warning. Years of carefully controlled rage were finally boiling over, and she turned her fury on me with devastating intensity. Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed for this family? She snarled as the officer secured the handcuffs behind her back. What I've given up so that you could play the sweet, innocent little sister while I did all the heavy lifting. Victoria stopped talking, Marcus pleaded, finally finding his voice. No, she snapped. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of watching her get everything handed to her while I have to fight for scraps. Grandma Rose's trust fund should have been mine. I was the one who worked in those flower shops every summer. I was the one who studied business and finance. But instead, it goes to Miss Perfect, who's too noble to even spend the money properly. Tom stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. Mrs. Sterling, I advise you to stop talking immediately. You're only making this worse for yourself. Victoria laughed bitterly. Worse? How could it possibly be worse? My entire life has been about cleaning up after Natalie's messes, protecting her from consequences, making sure she never had to face reality. And this is how she repays me. By nearly dying from the poison you put in her food? Detective Morrison asked. By being too stupid to appreciate what she had. Victoria exploded. Do you know how easy it would have been to just share? To acknowledge that I deserved some recognition for everything I've done? But no, St. Natalie has to keep it all for herself, while Marcus and I lose everything. The confession was more complete than anything we could have hoped for. Victoria was detailing her motives, her methods, and her complete lack of remorse while multiple cameras recorded every word. Marcus finally seemed to realize the magnitude of what was happening. Victoria, please, just stop talking. We need to call a lawyer. A lawyer. Victoria turned her rage on her husband. With what money, Marcus? We're bankrupt, remember? That brilliant business plan of yours has left us with nothing. Mrs. Sterling, Detective Morrison interrupted. I need to finish reading you your rights. As the Miranda warning continued, I found myself staring at my sister and trying to reconcile this venomous stranger with the woman who'd taught me to braid my hair and helped me with algebra homework. When had Victoria's love for our family transformed into this toxic resentment? When had sibling rivalry become murderous hatred? My parents stood frozen in shock, clutching each other as they watched their elder daughter being arrested for trying to kill their younger one. My father looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of 10 minutes. My mother was crying quietly, her hand pressed to her mouth as if she could somehow hold back the reality of what was happening. Tom appeared at my elbow, his expression professionally neutral but his eyes kind. Are you okay? I nodded, though I wasn't sure if that was true. Is it over? The immediate danger is over, he said carefully. But there's still the trial, the media attention, the family fallout. This is just the beginning of a very long process. Marcus was handcuffed and arrested as well, charged as an accessory to attempted murder based on his financial research and the recorded phone conversations about insurance policies. He went quietly, his earlier bluster completely deflated by the reality of the situation. As the police led Victoria toward the front door, she stopped and turned back to look at me one final time. The hatred in her eyes was so intense it was almost physical, like a slap across the face. "You think you've won?" she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the room despite the chaos around us. "But you've lost your family, Natalie. Mom and Dad will never forgive you for this. You'll spend the rest of your life alone, wondering if it was worth it." "Victoria," my mother said softly, her voice breaking. "How could you do this? How could you try to hurt your own sister?" Victoria's expression crumpled for just a moment, revealing the pain and desperation underneath all that anger. Because she never appreciated what she had, because she took everything for granted while I worked twice as hard for half the recognition. Then the moment passed, and the cold mask slipped back into place. "I hope you're happy, Natalie. I hope destroying me was everything you dreamed it would be." The police led her away, and suddenly the house was quiet except for my mother's muffled sobs and the sound of crime scene technicians documenting evidence in the kitchen. Tom began explaining the legal process to my parents while David arrived to take me home, having been monitoring the situation from the surveillance van. As we drove through the familiar streets of Riverside, I felt completely numb. We'd gotten the evidence we needed to convict Victoria, but at the cost of destroying what was left of our family. My parents were devastated, my sister would likely spend years in prison, and I would have to live with the knowledge that someone I'd loved had tried to murder me for money. "She's right about one thing," I said to David as we pulled into our driveway. "I have lost my family." David took my hand, his grip warm and steady. "You've lost the illusion of the family you thought you had, but you've gained something more valuable, the truth. And the truth is that Victoria made her own choices. You didn't force her to poison you. You didn't make her desperate for money. You didn't create the resentment that drove her to attempted murder." I knew he was right intellectually, but emotionally I felt like I was drowning in guilt and grief. Victoria had been my sister for 26 years. How do you mourn someone who's still alive but who was never really the person you thought they were? The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, media coverage, and family trauma. Victoria and Marcus were denied bail due to the severity of the charges and the risk of flight. The evidence against them was overwhelming: video surveillance, financial records, internet search histories, and Victoria's own recorded confession. My parents struggled to understand how they'd missed the signs of Victoria's desperation and resentment. They blamed themselves for not recognizing her financial troubles, for not intervening before things escalated to attempted murder. Family therapy sessions were scheduled, but the damage to our relationships felt irreparable. The media descended on Riverside like vultures, drawn by the sensational story of sisterly attempted murder at a wedding reception. "Wedding cake poisoner" became Victoria's tabloid nickname, and photographers camped outside our house for weeks trying to get pictures of the surviving sister. Tom and Maria became unexpected anchors in the chaos, providing practical support and emotional stability when my own family felt too fractured to function. They helped coordinate with lawyers, managed media requests, and made sure David and I had space to process what had happened without constant external pressure. Dr. Bennett monitored my physical recovery while recommending therapists who specialized in family trauma and betrayal. The oleander was finally completely out of my system, but the psychological effects of being systematically poisoned by someone I loved were much harder to heal. 3 months after Victoria's arrest, her lawyer approached the district attorney about a plea bargain. She was facing life in prison if convicted on all charges, but the prosecution was willing to consider a reduced sentence in exchange for a full confession and cooperation in understanding her methods. Victoria ultimately accepted a plea deal for 25 years without the possibility of parole. Marcus received 15 years as an accessory, having played a supporting but less direct role in the poisoning scheme. Both would be eligible for supervised release only after serving at least 2/3 of their sentences. The day of Victoria's sentencing, I sat in the courtroom gallery and listened as she finally told the complete truth about what she'd done and why. She detailed the months of planning, the gradual poisoning through family meals, the refinement of oleander extract specifically for my wedding cake, and the financial desperation that had driven her to attempt murder. But even in her confession, Victoria couldn't resist one final manipulation. She painted herself as a victim of circumstances, a devoted sister driven to desperation by financial ruin and family favoritism. She claimed to feel remorse for what she'd done while simultaneously justifying her actions as a response to years of perceived injustice. When given the opportunity to address the court, I stood and faced my sister directly. She looked smaller in her orange prison jumpsuit, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail without the expensive styling she'd always maintained. But her eyes still held that familiar combination of intelligence and calculation that had defined our relationship for so many years. "Victoria," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me, "I want you to know that I forgive you." She blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting those words. "I forgive you," I continued, "not because what you did was forgivable, but because carrying hatred for you would poison my life the way resentment poisoned yours. I hope that someday you can find peace with the choices you made and the consequences they brought." Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I thought I saw tears gathering in her eyes. But then she looked away, her jaw set in the stubborn line I remembered from childhood argument. The judge pronounced sentence, and Victoria was led away to begin serving her 25-year term. I never saw her again. 2 years later, I stood in the renovated flower shop that had once been my grandmother's flagship location on Main Street in Riverside. The afternoon sun streamed through the large front windows, illuminating displays of fresh arrangements and potted plants that filled the space with color and light. The familiar scent of roses and jasmine brought back memories of childhood visits with Grandma Rose, when she'd let me help arrange bouquets and taught me the names of different flowers. "The community center dedication is next week," Maria said, checking items off a clipboard as she surveyed our progress. "Are you sure you're ready for the publicity?" I nodded, adjusting a display of sunflowers near the register. This place has been sitting empty too long, and the town needs something positive to focus on." After Victoria's conviction, I'd struggled with what to do with the trust fund that had caused so much pain. The money felt tainted, connected to betrayal and attempted murder in ways that made it impossible to simply spend on myself. David and I had discussed various options, from donating it all to charity to setting up college scholarships, but nothing felt quite right. Then Tom had suggested something that changed my perspective entirely. Instead of running from the legacy that had made me a target, why not use it to create something that would honor both my grandmother's memory and the second chance I'd been given? The answer came to me during one of my therapy sessions with Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma specialist, who'd helped me process the complex emotions surrounding Victoria's betrayal. She'd mentioned how many families in Riverside struggled with mental health issues, but couldn't afford professional counseling services. That conversation sparked an idea that grew into the Rose Winters Community Center, a combination flower shop, counseling facility and educational space housed in my grandmother's old building. The flower shop would provide sustainable income through sales and arrangements for local events, while the counseling center would offer sliding-scale therapy services to families dealing with crisis situations. The educational component included workshops on financial literacy, conflict resolution, and healthy family communication, all the things that might have prevented Victoria's desperation from escalating to attempted murder, if they'd been available when she needed them. Dr. Bennett had agreed to serve on the board of directors, along with Tom and Maria, my father and several other community leaders. Even Detective Morrison had volunteered to help with security training and crisis interim protocols. "Mrs. Chen," called a familiar voice from the front of the shop. I turned to see Ashley Morrison, Detective Morrison's teenage daughter, wheeling in a cart of fresh flowers from the delivery truck outside. "Just Natalie is fine," I reminded her with a smile. Ashley had been working for me part-time after school, helping with deliveries and learning the flower business. She was saving money for college and planning to study social work, inspired partly by what she'd witnessed during Victoria's case. "The roses from Portland arrived," Ashley announced, carefully transferring the buckets of cut flowers to the refrigerated display case. "Mrs. Patterson wants 24 red roses for her anniversary dinner tomorrow." "Perfect timing," I said, making a note in the order book. Miss Patterson had been one of my grandmother's regular customers, and maintaining those relationships felt like honoring Rose's legacy in a tangible way. The bell above the front door chimed, and David entered carrying takeout bags from the Thai restaurant down the street. His uniform showed he'd come straight from the base, where he'd been promoted to senior instructor after our experience with Victoria had demonstrated his ability to handle complex, sensitive situations. "Lunch delivery," he announced, setting the bags on the small table we'd placed in the back corner of the shop. Tom called. He and Maria are driving down from Portland tonight for the pre-dedication meeting. I washed my hands at the small sink behind the counter and joined David at the table. The pad thai smelled wonderful, and I realized I hadn't eaten since early morning. Running a business was more demanding than I'd expected, but also more rewarding than my teaching job had ever been. Any word from your parents? David asked carefully. The relationship with my parents remained complicated. They'd eventually accepted the truth about Victoria's actions, but guilt and grief had changed the dynamics of our family in ways that were still evolving. They'd supported the community center project financially and emotionally, but there was an underlying fragility to our interactions now, a careful politeness that hadn't existed before. Mom's coming to the dedication ceremony. Dad's still not sure he's ready for that much public attention. The media coverage of Victoria's case had been intense and largely sensationalized. Wedding cake poisoner sentenced had been front-page news across Oregon, and the story had been picked up by national outlets fascinated by the dramatic family betrayal. My parents had struggled with the publicity, feeling simultaneously victimized by Victoria's actions and judged by the community for not recognizing the warning sign. My father had retired early from his job at the bank, claiming health concerns, but I suspected he simply couldn't handle the whispers and stares from people who remembered him as Victoria's proud parent. My mother had thrown herself into volunteer work with senior citizens, perhaps seeking redemption through service to others. They'll come around eventually, David said, squeezing my hand across the table. This project shows them that something positive came from all that pain. I hoped he was right. The community center was partly my attempt to prove that Victoria's actions hadn't destroyed me, that I could transform trauma into healing for others. But it was also my way of staying connected to Riverside despite everything that had happened here. After lunch, Ashley helped me prepare several arrangements for local deliveries, while David reviewed security protocols for the dedication event. Tom had insisted on certain precautions, even though Victoria was securely imprisoned and Marcus had been transferred to a facility in another state. The habits of protective vigilance were hard to break. Around 4 o'clock, Dr. Patricia Wells arrived for her first shift at the counseling center. She was a licensed family therapist who'd moved to Riverside specifically to work with our program, drawn by the innovative combination of business and social services. "How are you feeling about next week?" she asked as I showed her to the small office space we'd created in what used to be my grandmother's storage room. "Nervous," I admitted. "Excited but nervous. This represents a lot of hopes and dreams, and a lot of healing," Dr. Wells added gently. "For you and for the families we'll serve." She was right. The community center was as much about my own recovery as it was about helping others. Working with flowers every day reminded me of my grandmother's strength and wisdom. Counseling families in crisis helped me process my own experience with betrayal and forgiveness. Creating something beautiful and useful from the resources Victoria had tried to steal felt like the ultimate victory over her attempt to destroy my life. That evening, David and I walked through downtown Riverside as the sun set behind the Coast Range Mountains. The town looked different to me now, less like the childhood haven I'd idealized and more like a real place with real problems that required real solutions. "Do you ever regret staying?" David asked as we paused in front of the community center, admiring the new sign that read Rose Winters Community Center, growing together through life's challenges. I considered the question seriously. We could have moved anywhere after Victoria's conviction. David's military career was portable, and my trust fund would have allowed us to start over in a place without painful memories and difficult associations. Sometimes, I said honestly, but running away would have meant Victoria won in a different way. She would have succeeded in driving me away from everything I loved about this place. And now I get to redefine what this place means to me. Instead of being the town where my sister tried to kill me, Riverside becomes the place where I built something meaningful from the ashes of that betrayal. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. In a few days, the community center would officially open with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by local officials, members of the press, and families who were already on the waiting list for counseling services. Tom and Maria would be there, of course, along with Dr. Bennett and Detective Morrison and dozens of other people who'd supported us through the darkest period of our lives. My parents would probably attend, sitting quietly in the back and trying to process their complicated feelings about everything that had led to this moment. Victoria's absence would be felt but not mourned, She'd made her choices and was living with the consequences in a federal prison 3 states away. I'd kept my promise to forgive her, but that didn't mean I missed her presence in my life. Some relationships are too damaged by betrayal to ever be repaired, and acceptance of that reality was part of my healing process. I got a letter from Grandma Rose's old business partner today, I told David as we started walking home. Eleanor wants to visit the community center when it opens. She said Rose would have been proud of what we're doing. She would have been, David agreed. This is exactly the kind of project she would have supported. Eleanor Martinez had been Rose's closest friend and co-investor in the flower shop business. She'd moved to California after Rose's death but had stayed in touch through Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. Her approval of the community center project meant more to me than any newspaper review or official recognition. The next morning brought a flurry of final preparation. Delivery trucks arrived with furniture for the counseling offices. Ashley helped me arrange massive displays of flowers throughout the building, and David coordinated with Tom on security details for the dedication ceremony. Wells conducted final walkthroughs of her office spaces, making sure everything was ready for the families who would soon depend on her services. The sliding scale fee structure we'd developed meant that no one would be turned away due to inability to pay, but everyone would contribute something to maintain their dignity and investment in the process. The morning news crew wants to interview you before the ceremony, Ashley informed me, checking messages on the center's new phone system, and the mayor's office called to confirm his attendance. I nodded, feeling butterflies in my stomach. Public speaking had never been my strength, but this project was too important to let nervousness interfere with spreading awareness about our services. The day of the dedication dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp October air that made Oregon autumns legendary. I arrived at the community center early to oversee final details and found Tom already there, conducting a security sweep with his characteristic thoroughness. All clear, he reported. Perimeter is secure, emergency exits are clearly marked, and we have discreet coverage from multiple angles. Tom, I said gently, this is a community center opening, not a military operation. He smiled, but his eyes remained alert. Old habits. Besides, after everything you've been through, a little extra caution never hurt anyone. Maria arrived with coffee and pastries from the local bakery, followed shortly by Dr. Bennett and Detective Morrison with their family. The building began to fill with people I'd known my entire life, neighbors and friends who'd supported me through the trauma of Victoria's betrayal and wanted to celebrate this new chapter. My parents arrived just before the ceremony began, looking older but more peaceful than they had in months. My mother hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes as she looked around the transformed space. She would have loved this, Mom whispered, and I knew she meant Grandma Rose rather than Victoria. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was brief but meaningful. Mayor Henderson spoke about the importance of community resources for mental health and family support. Dr. Wells explained the services that would be available and how families could access them. I gave a short speech about transformation and healing, about building something positive from life's most difficult experiences. As I cut, the red ribbon stretched across the front entrance, cameras flashed and a small crowd applauded. But what mattered most to me were the faces of the people who'd gathered to support this dream. Tom and Maria, who'd risked their careers to help me find justice. Bennett, who'd saved my life and continued to provide medical support. David, whose love had never wavered despite everything we'd faced together. The community center opened its doors to visitors, and I watched families explore the space that would soon provide them with resources for healing and growth. Children played in the small garden area we'd created outside, while their parents learned about counseling services and support groups. Late that afternoon, after the crowds had dispersed and the media had packed up their equipment, I found myself alone in the flower shop portion of the building. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows just as it had in my childhood memories, illuminating displays of roses and daisies and chrysanthemums. I pulled out the small framed photograph I'd placed behind the register, showing my grandmother at work in this same space 50 years earlier. Rose Winters had built a successful business through determination and kindness, creating beauty and joy for her community while supporting her family. Victoria had tried to destroy that legacy out of jealousy and greed, but she'd ultimately failed. The trust fund she'd coveted was now funding services that would help prevent other families from experiencing the kind of crisis that had torn ours apart. The plants she'd used as weapons were now bringing comfort and healing to people who needed both. David found me there as the sun began to set, studying the photograph and thinking about the circular nature of justice and redemption. Penny for your thoughts, he said, slipping his arms around me from behind. Just thinking about how different things could have been, I replied, leaning back against his chest. If Victoria had talked to me about her financial problems instead of trying to solve them through murder, if she'd been able to see that love isn't a zero-sum game, that helping others doesn't diminish what you have, do you think she understands that now? I considered the question seriously. Victoria had been in prison for 2 years, with at least 23 more to serve. I'd heard from our mutual acquaintances that she was taking college courses and working in the prison library, but I had no direct contact with her and no desire to establish any. I hope so, I said finally. I hope she's finding some peace with the choices she made and the consequences they brought. But whether she does or not, I can't let her past actions define my future happiness. As we locked up the community center and headed home, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing from my life for years. The girl who'd grown up in Victoria's shadow was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her own strength and wasn't afraid to use it for good. The trust fund that had nearly cost me my life was now creating opportunities for healing and growth throughout our community. The sister who'd tried to poison me was serving her sentence while I built something beautiful from the ashes of her betrayal. Grandma Rose's flower shop was blooming again, filled with new purpose and surrounded by the sound of children playing and families healing. And somewhere in the mix of jasmine and roses that filled the evening air, I could almost hear her voice whispering approval. That's my girl. That's exactly what strength looks like. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain but filled with possibility. David and I were talking about starting a family, about expanding the community center's services, about maybe opening additional locations in other small towns that needed similar resources. But tonight it was enough to walk home through the familiar streets of Riverside, knowing that I'd transformed the worst experience of my life into something that would help other families avoid similar tragedy. Victoria had tried to write the ending to my story, but I'd taken back the pen and written something completely different, something beautiful, something healing, something worthy of the trust that had been placed in me by a grandmother who'd believed I would use her legacy wisely. And in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.